the main feature of this relaxed state that seems to facilitate not only psi, but to be an optimal state for, or an essential state for a proper meditative or contemplative practice, has to do intimately with communication and with social engagement. So who or what are you engaging with socially when you're engaging in a contemplative practice? Everyone, welcome back to MindMatters. Today we are going to be connecting some dots on some of the various topics we've been discussing in the previous months, including a little bit of process philosophy, some first sight, referencing our interview with Dr. James Carpenter, and our interviews with Father Joseph Azize, and something we haven't really talked about on the show. We might have mentioned it in passing a couple times, and that's Polyvagal Theory. So I'm going to be talking about this book, recent book, Accessing the Healing Power of the Vagus Nerve by Stanley Rosenberg. Maybe to start out with, I'll give a little bit of an overview of polyvagal theory, and then we'll get into how it might relate to these other things that we've been talking about, some of the connections, and maybe some of what that might imply and the possibilities that will open up as a result of looking at all of these things together. So polyvagal theory, there was the original, or the understanding of the autonomic nervous system has evolved and changed over the more than a century that we've had a name for it. And the prevailing view up until last couple decades was that there's basically two aspects of the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic, kind of your fight or flight system as opposed to your rest and digest system. So it was like, it can be in one or the other. And if you want to get out of a stressful state, an anxious, fearful state, you can enter your rest and digest state and kind of relax and chill out and get rid of that stress. But it turns out that that's actually not a complete picture of the way that nervous system works. That the so-called parasympathetic system there's actually more, there's two aspects to it. It has to do with the vagus nerve, which is one of the cranial nerves, the 10th cranial nerve. And there are two branches to it. There's a dorsal and a ventral branch. The ventral innervates aspects of the head and the thorax, the upper chest, and the organs in there, and then the dorsal, the rear branch, goes and kind of innervates all the organs. Well, some up here, but also organs in the stomach and the abdomen and the lower parts. So your stomach, your intestines, spleen, liver, something like that. A bunch of those organs. Not really important which ones for our purposes, but the dorsal system there's actually two fear states, and this was a discovery and a development from Dr. Stephen Porges. Not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, but he developed this polyvagal theory over the last few decades. And he's got a book called Polyvagal Theory with a collection of his papers, which is quite difficult reading, but with some definitely interesting stuff in there. He's got a version written in the last couple of years, published in the past couple of years, that's a bit more accessible. I haven't read that one yet, but planning on it. He's a friend of the author of this book, Stanley Rosenberg, who is he's an osteopath, craniosacral therapy guy. He does rolfing. He's an American living in Denmark, I believe. Mm-hmm. He's lived there for past couple decades. And so he wrote this book kind of putting together polyvagal theory with his kind of hands-on practice. But to get back to the dorsal and ventral branch, I mentioned that there's kind of two fear states. So when the dorsal branch of the vagus nerve is activated and you're in that state of the autonomic nervous system, it's what is commonly called, what's called immobilization with fear. So there's almost a hierarchy of autonomic states that you can be in. And the basic state, the lowest state, is this state of dorsal vagal activation, immobilization with fear. This is where If you look at mammals or various animals that get in an encounter with a predator, and an encounter that is almost certain to produce death, there's an immobilization, a total shutdown of the system that goes on. So there are various examples, like a gazelle being hunted by a lion, and the lion gets this like young gazelle in its jaws, and the gazelle will just go limp. It's almost playing dead, but it's an automatic, uncontrolled reaction. It's strictly a product of the nervous system that goes into this shutdown mode. It preserves energy. It can fend off predators, because if a certain predator thinks an animal's already dead, it might not be interested in it any longer. And so what'll often happen is the lion will feel this, or tiger or whatever will feel this, its prey go totally limp, and then just lose interest and drop it and go off elsewhere. And then after a minute or two, the animal will kind of come back and stand up and shake it off. Literally, they'll shake, and then just go off, and as if nothing ever happened, because that's the way our nervous system seems to have developed, with these kind of automatic states that are appropriate to the situation at hand. Above that is the spinal sympathetic activation system. So in that state, that's your sympathetic fight or flight system. So that's when you're mobilized to either engage in conflict and battle with the threat, or head on out of there and run away. And it's a graduated response. So if you or the animal is in a situation where it thinks it can, or I don't know if think would be the right word, where it senses or intuits that it can fight and potentially win, or that it can get away, that it's fast enough, it will do so. But if it's in a situation where there's no hope, where it seems like death is imminent, then it will shut down. And above that is the third state, the kind of highest state of activation, is the ventral vagus nerve. And that is what Rosenberg and Porges call something like a state of social engagement. So that's the ordinary state of engagement that you find most mammals and humans in, where they are relaxed, able to socially converse with each other, essentially, basically get along and communicate. And there are various pathologies or things that go wrong with some of these states. So the thing about humans is that we don't really shake off our trauma as easily as a lot of animals do. So if we're in a situation that seems life-threatening, where the end is imminent, oftentimes that can be something experienced as a child. It could be a rape, it could be an assault that is perceived on some level as totally threatening, or repeated assaults that leave a person in a state of kind of chronic dorsal stimulation. And this can show up as depression, as post-traumatic stress disorder, but a specific type, because this understanding of the Polyvagal Theory, as Rosenberg points out, should lead us to even understand PTSD in a different way, that there are actually two types of PTSD. There's post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic, post-traumatic shutdown. So for someone suffering from PTSD, they may be in a state of like depression and apathy and extremely low energy, or they might be in a state of a hyper-aroused state of fear and anxiety. When I get maybe triggered by an event or a sound or something that basically activates that traumatic experience that hasn't been properly digested, like a backfiring car that it sounds like a gunshot and brings them back to the war zone, for instance. And above that, a state of chronic sympathetic activation is that anxious, chronic anxiety state. And the problem with both of those states is not only do they have deleterious effects on one's health and general functioning in life, but they will also, because they're not in that ventral state of social engagement, it affects their relationships and their ability to communicate. Rosenberg argues that there's actually a polyvagal component to everything from like ADHD, autism, what we understand as mostly physical conditions like COPD, asthma, and that working on the autonomic nervous system and the cranial nerves in particular, not just the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve, but the ones associated with it, like I believe numbers 5, 7, 9, 10, 11. Can't remember if 12 is part of that or not. That those, by working on the functioning of those nerves and the bodily architecture that supports those nerves and gives them space to branch and move, that by fixing blockages and fixing alignment, like in the spine and in the various bones associated with where these nerves are and the various organs, and bringing that activation of the state up from dorsal or the sympathetic up into the ventral state, that not only does it bring about a state of better mental health, but also physical health. So in this book, he quotes his, what he's learned and what he's seen in his practice over the years, and the kind of success he's had with these various conditions, strictly by focusing on bringing these nerves back into their proper state of functioning. And the connection I want to make here is with some of the various other things that we've been talking about, because the ventral vagus nerve, when we're in that state of social engagement, there are certain qualities that certain emotional states associated with that state and that of ventral vagal activation. One of which is that it is a positive emotion state, where that's where we're feeling engaged with the people around us. It can be a state of happiness or joy or just getting along with people. Also a state of openness. Actually, I want to read just a couple of the things Rosenberg writes about this state in particular. For instance, he writes, "If we have a well-functioning nervous system and are socially engaged, we might naturally meet a new situation with openness, trust, and positive expectations. We feel safe and might first try to communicate, cooperate, and share. Even in the face of a threat, our behavior might still be open and friendly at first. Sometimes this positive pro-social behavior can also make the other person feel safe, which in turn might be enough to diffuse a potentially threatening situation." And of course, if that doesn't work, then our nervous system will go down a notch and enter fight or flight mode, where it's like, the fists are raised, or we're getting the hell out of there. Or it might go totally south to the point where we just shut down and pass out or dissociate and kind of like leave our bodies so that we don't have to experience whatever's going to happen to us. And a couple other ones. This is about, this is under the heading, the 3 neural pathways of the autonomic nervous system. So the ventral branch of the vagus nerve relates to positive emotions of joy, satisfaction, and love. In terms of behavior, it expresses itself in positive social activities with friends and loved ones. The state of social engagement supports social behaviors in which we support and share with other people. Cooperation with others usually improves our chances for survival. We talk together, sing together, dance together, share a meal, cooperate to complete a project, teach and nurture children, etc. And then that's, of course, in contrast to states like mobilization with fear, where you see that state expressed in emotions like anger or fear, fight or flight, and then, of course, immobilization with fear. And he characterizes that as that's when we face an overwhelming force and imminent destruction. Activation of this pathway fosters feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, and apathy, manifesting in withdrawal and shutdown. So that's a basic rundown of polyvagal theory. Now, the reason I found that interesting and what I wanted to talk about today, aside from it just being interesting in and of itself, is it relates in certain interesting ways to the things we've been discussing. One of which was our conversations with Joseph Azize, where he was describing Gurdjieff's contemplative exercises and the phenomena and practices associated with them. And basically, if I could summarize them just really in a simplified form, some of the important features of those are relaxation and entering into this state, this non-fearful state. You could call it immobilization without fear. That is a combination of dorsal and ventral activity. And that, I didn't mention that one, that's one of the hybrid states. There are two hybrid states of autonomic nervous system activation. There is dorsal and ventral together, so the top state and the bottom state, which is immobilization without fear. And that would be an example of immobilization where there's intimacy involved. So it might be like cuddling or sleeping next to someone, or being in a totally relaxed state where you don't feel the need to engage in any kind of activity, but there's this kind of connection there. There's a safety being immobile with another person. But then the other hybrid state is mobilization without fear. So that would be the second and third. That's sympathetic activation and ventral activation. That's where you're in a mobilized state, but it's not involved with fear. That might be engaging in sports, playing games, and playing. So you see this in kids where they're having fun, or in animals. You watch dogs who are just playing with each other and biting at each other for hours on end, and they're having a good time. They're wagging their tails. They're not actually fighting. They're playing, but it resembles fighting. So not only are there those three states, there are hybrid states. So it made me wonder if there is a connection between, of course, I think it's undoubted and kind of obvious that there must be a connection, but to tease out what those connections might be. And it seems to me when entering into a collected state, as Father Azize was talking about, that one of the things we're actually doing is making sure we're getting out of that strict dorsal and sympathetic activation and entering a more ventral vagus associated state, where we are relaxed, where we are in a state of positive feeling, where we're not fearful, because it's like if you imagine. I think we joked about it in the past about meditating and trying to meditate, trying really hard to meditate, right? Where you're fighting yourself to meditate, and you're not relaxed. Your muscles are tense. Your mind is tense. Your mind is contracted, and you're basically not in a state conducive to relaxation if you're really trying really hard to relax.
Exactly.
Did you want to say something?
Well, just that, and I may have mentioned this previously on the show, during my own meditative and breathing practices, I've realized that there was a certain amount of tension that I held in my facial muscles. And what this, in fact, prevented me from doing was relaxing enough at a certain stage in my practice to meditate, because all my emotions and tension were maintained throughout what should have been time spent meditating. And once I realized this physically, viscerally, that I needed to let go of that facial tension, I was much better able to meditate. And my mental, emotional state was put into such a position that I was that it changed for the better. So what Rosenberg is speaking about here in a number of ways is how to reach that level of emotional openness via the body, where we don't naturally think that by releasing some amount of tension or increasing our vagal tone, that this way through the body is going to affect our minds and the way that we interact with ourselves and the way that we perceive things cognitively, or the way that we interact with others. So this was a very accessible way of explaining, I think, to his readers what Porges is getting at in his Polyvagal Theory. And you mentioned the contemplation exercises by Gurdjieff. I was thinking of his movements, because Gurdjieff's movements were all about control and being as physically aware and relaxed in oneself as one could be in order to reach a state of control that was elevated, that was in a kind of synchronous movement with those that you're dancing with and performing for, and for yourself. And what's interesting is that Rosenberg is coming at this book in his own movement way, his own pathway, his own kind of way of learning all of this, and that is that he started off as an actor, and he was doing a kind of experimental theater where he was instructed to try out scenes and be aware of oneself physically in particular ways, and to try different things out. And he became so aware of himself and the importance of his bodily awareness that he moved into doing body work. And this developed into a kind of sideline career, into a full-blown career or vocation, into doing osteopathy and craniosacral therapy. And so in learning about movement, in learning about how the fascia and the muscles actually sit on certain nerves, for instance, he came at the polyvagal theory and the importance of the tonality of the vagus nerve from the other direction. He realized that when you move a certain way, or when you receive this kind of deep tissue therapy, for instance, that you could be stimulating and assisting a person not only in not having a backache or sitting with a better posture or moving more articulately, but that a whole set of therapeutic mind and soul elements were opened up and received benefit as well. So I found that very interesting, and it did remind me of Gurdjieff's movements and how he, even if he didn't have the language to describe, the various cranial nerves and the vagus nerve and all of its functioning in the body, he was in his own way showing people how to move, and also his exercises in some cases were callbacks to Sufi psycho-spiritual movements and included special breathing, and which would mean probably stimulation of the vagus nerve. So it's very interesting to see how Gurdjieff and Rosenberg have come at this understanding through their own through the back door, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, that reminded me of a couple things. One, Gurdjieff actually does mention the vagus nerve in Beelzebub's Tales with a passing reference to the wandering nerves of the stomach. The vagus is called the wandering nerve because it just goes all over the place.
Right.
And that was in reference to in space, Beelzebub and his crew are heading to some planet or another, and essentially a bell rings and it's time for dinner. But it's a special type of dinner, and it is a special type of vibration that affects the wandering nerves of the stomach. And they're not being called to their regular dinner where they're going to eat food. They're being called to their second being food dinner where they're going to eat air. In other words, they're going to breathe. So I just found that an interesting connection that he's associating, whether he was aware of these features of the vagus nerve or not, because polyvagal theory itself is relatively new. who knows? Gurdjieff was an intuitive guy. He might have guessed. He might have, seen the connection. But associating the vagus nerve with breathing, with conscious breathing, in this, 1-2 sentences in Beelzebub's Tales, because, like you said, this is something we have talked about before on the show briefly. Is that there are breathing techniques that do activate the vagus nerve because it runs through your throat in the areas of the trachea, and where air actually passes through the muscles that control the flow of air and the production of sound when you speak. So certain breathing exercises do stimulate the vagus nerve. And back to Gurdjieff again, I mentioned a basic breakdown of his exercises, and I mentioned relaxation. That's one essential component, is getting into a relaxed state, and not only a physically relaxed state, but an emotional and a mentally relaxed state, but also sensation, a focus on physical sensation in the body. And that's something Rosenberg is keen on, as well as another friend of Porges, Stephen Levine, who wrote what was his book? In an Unspoken Voice.
Mm-hmm.
But on sensation, I'll just read a couple sentences from Rosenberg. He says, "Sensing our own bodies and staying grounded helps us to remain in a ventral vagal state." And that's that top ideal vagal state. "Awareness of our body can help us avoid getting carried away by emotions that can lead to faulty neuroception." We won't talk about neuroception. But so there's this focus on sensation. Again, that's an integral part of Gurdjieff's type of meditative or contemplative practice. But also, not just those two things, because, of course, in the Gurdjieff system, there's always a focus on 3 aspects of being, your physical body, your emotional nature, and your thinking, your thought, your mind. So there is in the Gurdjieff exercises, you're not just shutting off your mind to go off into some astral plane and just chill out and have a great experience. No, you have attention. You're aware. You're actively every aspect of the exercise. There's an active component. So you're actively sensing your body, different parts of your body, actively relaxing and releasing tension in various parts of your body, actively visualizing things in certain cases, and actively directing the whole process. You're not just shutting off for an hour or 10 minutes or 5 minutes. It's an actual exercise. That's why he used that word. It's not time off. It's actual work. It's an exercise.
Mm-hmm.
So that leads me to first sight and our discussion with Jim Carpenter. Because, funny thing, when you read the description of the ideal state for, how would you call it in first sight theory? For psi receptivity and, or maybe that's a good way to put it. This is what Carpenter writes in the section on personal exploration of psi. He writes, am I on the right page here? 338. Okay. So this is in his conclusion to this chapter, chapter 20. "So if you wish to explore psi in a personal way, here are some examples of exploration that can give you hints on how to proceed. It is interesting to note that all of them, in different ways, stress some things that are stressed by first sight theory." These are all the people he's talking about that are kind of teaching skills. "It is important to develop openness to psi, a working belief that is real, that it is real and valid. You should strongly want to succeed at expressing psi, and develop ways to make that intention seep into the unconscious levels of your functioning. You should do things to diminish your anxiety and heighten your experience of playful creativeness. Be disciplined and objective, and protect yourself from self-deception. Have a scientific attitude, seeking more than self-gratification." There was one other important feature that Sinclair, McMonigal, Batchelder, and Owen had in common. They worked in groups. They were not to do they were exploring alone. So this is after a section, dealing with various people, the names I just mentioned, giving their own suggestions on basically how to, develop your psi or something to that effect. And so what Carpenter's doing is he's pointing out the aspects of their advice that have something in common with his theory. So, and his theory is based on the parapsychological research on the features or states or personality characteristics that are conducive to high psi scoring. So those are some of those are openness as opposed to kind of closed-mindedness. That it does, if you're, and going back to Rosenberg, like he described that encounter that you're likely to have if you're in a ventral state, if you, it is one of openness, trust, and an openness to experience. Mm-hmm. And
well, for those who haven't heard our interview on this subject, so this isn't having psi for the sake of being able to predict lucky numbers at a horse race, for instance. This is about for lack of a better term, intuitive ability to perceive things, to have knowledge of yourself, hopefully, and others, and things around you that you may not necessarily be ready to quantify with the normal kind of causal interactions, for instance. Mm-hmm. I don't know if there's a better way of explaining that or not.
Well, I just want to touch on the idea that, as Carpenter brought up during the interview, that it's not really knowledge. Yeah. It's inklings. It's an inkling of something that's unknowable. So you can't really say that it's knowledge. You're not getting knowledge from it, and so in that sense, you're not really learning anything. It's, you might learn how to deal with that kind of information, but it's really not, it's not part of it's not a real way to gain information. And I think he talks about the fact that it's, that usually when you are in deep need and you are, open really in some fundamentally unconscious way to any sort of hope, any inkling of a way out of a situation, that psi can manifest in dreams or in strong feelings, strong gut instincts. Okay, I need to do this or I need to do that, but it's not a form of knowledge in the sense that you will never know for sure if that inkling was even an inkling,
right? Because all you have is the inkling. You've got you might see a person and get a bad feeling, and then afterwards nothing happens. So all you're left with is this memory of this bad feeling. You don't know if you just had a bit of bad gas that gave you a bad feeling when you saw this guy, or if you're picking up on something. And then the only way to actually gain knowledge for it, according to the theory and Carpenter, is to then confirm it, right? So it's the confirmation that kind of solidifies the inkling that you got, because before that it's just an inkling. It may or may not be based in some actual information that was received on a subliminal level, but it hasn't. But you have no way of knowing, because according to Carpenter's epistemology, I would say that you in this world, in this physical world as we experience it, we only can be said to know something if we have an experiential confirmation of it, some way of knowing that we know, as opposed to let's say I have a dream. If I have a dream that a loved one is in trouble or has experienced an injury or is just in trouble in some sense. If I never find out that any of my relatives had, anything bad happen to them, and I can't confirm or deny it, I can't say that I have knowledge about it, because I don't know whether it was just a random dream or whether it was associated with something. But if I can confirm it, and then I find out, right when I was having that dream, the next day I find out that my relative got in this accident and had to go to the hospital, then it's like, that seems to suggest that there was something more to that dream than just a random thing that I experienced during my dream state. So, but to, like you were saying first, Ilan, for people who haven't watched that show yet or haven't read the book, just to give a really simple rundown, it is those inklings, those snatches of information or images or feelings or things of that sort that are what Carpenter is talking about when he's talking about first sight theory. So his epistemology or his philosophy of how this is happening is that we are essentially minds and have access to this wide range of meaning. We are minds are meaning-making things. And we're constantly in this world of meaning, and we're constantly receiving signals, we're constantly prehending these meanings in the world. Some of them rise to the level of experience or consciousness, whether it's in a sensation in our bodies or even a subliminal effect, like a raising of our heartbeat, or we start to sweat a little bit and we don't realize why, because we're constantly, our minds and our bodies to a degree, because I think they're an extension of our minds, are constantly receiving these meanings of import that are important in some way or valuable information of some way, because they may be hinting at some kind of danger. So we might not even be consciously aware of it, but our body might be sensing the danger and reacting to danger. And these are some of the experiments that he cites to show this, that there is, just like we respond that way to subliminal information. He talked about the latest studies that he was doing in our interview with him, that our bodies respond the same way to psi information. That subliminal effect on our physiology is the same. And so there is a survival aspect of staying alive to this information, that it's important to us because in order to be here and do what we do, we need to stay alive. So that information is heightened. It's like, okay, we're walking through the forest and there's a predator behind there, and we may just on a whim decide, oh, I'm gonna turn left instead of right. We have no idea why we did it. But there was just something enough of a response in our body and in our whatever motivates us on that subconscious, unconscious level to make us take that left path, whereas if we would have gone right, we would have been eaten. So, but it also raises those are the kind of more subliminal responses, which he focuses on because he's making a comparison to the subliminal literature of psychological studies. But it does rise to the level of conscious awareness, where it might be something like a dream or a waking vision or a thought that comes into our minds. He gave the example of the time where he was just out of nowhere started thinking intently on one of his patients,
right?
And turns out that they were in a really bad state and needed to talk to him, and he was able to deal with that situation, and it just came into his mind. So. And again, was I just randomly thinking about that person? Was something I was thinking about before remind me of that person? And it had nothing to do with them and their situation and as they're living right now? Or was it actually because that person is important to me, that on that level of the subconscious, I'm receiving that meaning that's kind of seeping into my consciousness through my body and through the roots of my mind, essentially. So that's basically a brief rundown of the theory. We're going to have Jim back on the show sometime in the future to talk about more aspects of that. But getting back to the connections with polyvagal theory, like I was saying, in all of these studies, what he does is he looks at all of these features of all these states and characteristics and traits and how they do or don't facilitate this kind of psi function and the positive receptivity of psi information. And some of the features, you can't be in a fearful state, you can't be in an anxious state, you have to be in an open, relaxed state, open to the experience, relaxed, playfully creative. So that's a ventral vagal state where you're playful and involved with other people and socially engaged. So I'm wondering, maybe I'll ask him next time he's on if he's familiar with polyvagal theory, because I wouldn't be surprised if there was a connection between all of these states the constellation of all these states that he's describing and all these traits, and a ventral vagal state.
Mm-hmm.
That if they were able to measure or even just focus on the ventral state, if that would encompass a lot of these features that are conducive to psi functioning. So an interesting connection there. But the connection goes even a bit deeper than that, or stranger. Well, can't get much more strange than psi. But that is that psi is, like I said, dealing with this world of meaning where potentially you potentially there is a whole cosmos of meaning that is impinging on you in some way and affecting you in some way, and that you are receptive to. The vast majority of the things in the world are deemed irrelevant by the roots of your mind, because you have a specific purpose in your life at any given moment, in your body, in your space. So not only does something happening to maybe one random person in their apartment on the other side of the planet probably not affect you, and probably isn't important to you, the same would go, and it would even further for what's happening to some rock on Mars or out in the distant solar system or in another galaxy or whatever. Most of this stuff, the vast majority of things in the universe are irrelevant to you at any given moment. And that's why arguably your experience is channeled only to your immediate experience, because that's what's most important at the moment. Because if it wasn't, you wouldn't be experiencing it. But there's this potential for all these things going out there. So while a rock on the far side of the moon or on Mars may not be important, if there's an asteroid hurtling towards space that scientists haven't identified yet, or a comet, that might be important too. And you might have people starting to get visions of the apocalypse and fire and brimstone, because who knows, that might be on a collision course. Or there might be intelligences out there, and if somewhere out in this vast universe there might be other intelligences, and is it possible to communicate with other intelligences, not just other humans, but maybe animals, maybe something unknown, something that you might refer to as angels or just higher powers or whatever. And so one of the interesting possible connections I see there is that you have this vagal state, right, of social engagement, of communication. The main feature of this relaxed state that seems to facilitate not only psi, but to be an optimal state an essential state for a proper meditative or contemplative practice, has to do intimately with communication and with social engagement. So who or what are you engaging with socially when you're in this specific situation where you're alone in your room, sitting or lying down or whatever, and engaging in a contemplative practice? Well, it's not with anyone else in the room with you. It could be yourself, different aspects of your own being, and the vast cosmos of your own consciousness, or potentially even weirder stuff than that. And that's where we get into aspects of like what we were talking about with Steve Hertenstein and Ibn al-Arabi and prophets and mystics, and what's actually going on in a lot of those cases. Well, again, just like with psi information, maybe we can't know for certain what's going on, but I think all of these things together give a kind of hint of what may be going on. That there is some kind of communication that is going on, whether it's with one's self, however you might define that, or with Ibn al-Arabi talking to the prophets and going on mystical journeys with them and receiving information. And
so it's very possible, for instance, that Ibn al-Arabi and guys like Gurdjieff were wired, for lack of a better term, or had a certain constitution or state of their nervous system physically that, in addition to their practices and their focus, enabled them to open their minds, to stretch their minds, to exercise their intuitions, to contemplate things that were true based on knowledge, conscious knowledge that they attained through other teachers, through learnings. And this was a kind of a positive reinforcement mechanism that they worked on all their lives and sought to teach in their own ways and to show other people based on their own level of being. So there is a definite component to a person's development and level of being and the state of health or non-health of their nervous systems is essentially what you're saying. And just one thought I wanted to share, as I was reading Rosenberg, I was just thinking about all of these horrible riots and all the violence that we're seeing in the U.S. at the moment and in Europe to some degree. And I thought, gosh, these people are so reactive. They're so, even if they're working together on some level and in their violence, that physically and emotionally they're quite unhealthy. That they haven't developed any level of vagal tone, or I mean, this is just me speculating as I'm reading this, but you don't imagine someone who is healthy in body, mind, and spirit going out and lashing out and being so singularly focused on destruction and not creating any kind of opening for any reasonable openness with others.
Well, that makes me think of what you were talking about, Harrison, with the shutdown of the nervous system and the shutdown of the economy that occurred, prior to a lot of people, beginning to riot, and wondering if there was a connection and maybe some form of the hybrid activation, so that it is like a mobilization with fear, a reaction really on a nervous system level, an unconscious reaction and overreaction really to many perceived slights that have just irritated a nervous system that's very volatile and that is can't really handle the kinds of stress that are being put on it. And I think in many cases that I think that could help maybe explain why things really, the flames were really fanned just recently. Obviously there are other people who are a little bit more instrumental about their violence, but I think a large number of people, are like in some form of that hybrid state, like you were talking about. I had one question about what you were talking about, Harrison, with the belief, the necessity of belief in psi to be part of the ability to actually receive psi information. And it made me wonder if belief in psi wasn't the only belief that you needed to have. If the belief system of the individual plays just as big a role in the kinds of information that come in, because like you get like Ibn al-Arabi, he's communicating with Jesus and Allah and Muhammad and Adam and Moses and everybody. Yeah. And then you have somebody like Gurdjieff. He has different beliefs, and I know that there were some hints that he was communicating perhaps through hypnosis with different intelligences, but we don't know exactly. I don't get the impression that he was talking to Adam or to Abraham, or maybe he was.
Well, hold that thought for a second. There's one statement in, I believe, Gurdjieff and the Women of the Rope, may or may not be that one, where he tells whoever he's talking to that his teacher that he's in constant communication with his teacher. In fact, he's communicating with him right now. You know, the implication being that it's on some other level that his teacher was, and whatever that might mean, you know, that's open to interpretation. But yeah,
but it just made me think about when you were asking, like, what are you communicating with when your social engagement system is on, but you're all by yourself, and so it got to me thinking of you know, like a cable network or something, like, you know, are you tuned into CNN? Are you tuned into Fox? You know, are you turned into Abraham? Are there objective sources of information in this realm versus subjective versus lies? Are there objective forms of intelligence that give different kinds of information? Are there different sources for different kinds of information, and that can help explain why you know, you get this kind of recurring reoccurring forms throughout history that will pop up in mystical states.
Well, that's very interesting, because the first time we interviewed Joseph Azize, he talked about elementals as this source of negative information that was or had a influence over our emotions, that were kind of pushing the buttons of the limbic hijack of individuals, and raised the level of fear and hysteria to this almost macro level. So, you know, I think it goes both ways. But what you're saying, Corey, is are there these objective, you know, intelligent sources of information in the universe that we have access to? And this just gets my thinking back to the idea of, what are we doing when we're alone by ourselves in our rooms, contemplating and in this totally relaxed state? And I would say that part of the answer to that is that we're emptying our cups to some degree. We're relinquishing ourselves of some of the noise and the reactivity that we may be picking up or have the habit of engaging in automatically, and making this kind of conscious effort to be ideally receptive to those things that would help us to reach greater clarity, and stretch our minds to these sources of information from without, and perhaps, you know, clear enough of our heads to access information that we already do have knowledge of and obtained at some point.
Well, I was just going to say that that fear that, you know, shuts down the you know, engagement system, that I think that there's a really good reason for a lot of people not to just let in psi. You know, that on some level there's, you know, that it's a good reason for a lot of people to just be materialist and to shut it out like it doesn't exist, because as you're pointing out, there's a, you know, an attunement of or a calibration of the nervous system that should take place, as well, probably, as we've been discussing, a calibration of the belief system, and a gaining of a lot of knowledge and a testing of beliefs, because I would imagine that you know, there's a lot worse things out there than, you know, like a grizzly bear, and that it can be very pernicious, you know, that you just don't know, right? There's you know, like he recommends, well, you know, go with you know, if you want to test this kind of stuff out, test it with a group of friends. I said, well, you can go test out the grizzly bear with a group of friends too, and see how that, you know, how far that gets you. But I think that there is our culture has let us down, or we've let one another down in some way, that we don't have a framework for understanding this very fundamental and common sense part of what was once common sense to our ancestors, that this is the kind of thing that you wouldn't have to convince anybody about, that you can gain information through a medium besides just your eyes and your ears and your taste buds, that there are other ways that you receive information. And just 100 years ago, people you pray and you'd expect some form of an inkling, or it's very much just a part of our not our daily experience, but especially in times of crisis, I think most people experience that kind of warning or hints, or just don't do this, or I'm open, I have no hope, and then there's some serendipity, something just like an angel seems to swoop in and to save you from whatever the chaos in your life, and it happens in a way that there's no clear cause and effect, why this person came into my life right at this point, and it was just exactly that person that I needed, but almost as though there was on some level some kind of a communication between yourself and a loved one, or somebody who became a close friend, or and then also vice versa. Somebody comes in and you think that they're the person there to help you, and then it turns out no, they're the worst thing that could ever happen to you. But at the same time, there are these things, serendipity, psi, all these things happen, and we don't in our materialistic culture, there's just no room for it. And there's no possible way that there could be room for it, which is sad, because Dr. Campbell makes such a great argument here, but it just falls on deaf ears, as it does time and time again, because of these beliefs we have. That's just a false belief that we have, and that's really all it comes down to, because it's not empirical, it's not based on science. I think a lot of it is based on fear, and it's based on, politics. It's based on reputations. It's based on how you get, if you can publish your material. It's based on the status quo, but it's not true. It's a false belief, and adjusting that belief, or readjusting that belief, is something that I think it will take the work of like scientists, but then also the work of the individual to test that kind of stuff and really seek to rectify that for him or herself in as safe and as practical a way possible. I don't know if seeking psi information, trying to actually engage in that is the right way to do it. Yeah. But reading about it, learning about it, knowing, and like you were saying, doing these exercises and calibrating your machine and your nervous system, and becoming healthy, so that the slight breeze doesn't turn you into a militant in the streets. But that's
and you don't want to blast the doors of perception open, right? It's like I think William Chittick had written something in Sufi Path of Knowledge in reference to a passage from Ibn al-Arabi about something like that. In the Western world, there's this kind of obsession with altered states and exploring the realms of the whatever, and yet without the realization that there are realms and aspects of the imaginal world that are worse than the worst jungle, with dangers that are lurking and that you can't possibly know. And yet there seems to be like there's a kind of spiritual narcissism about just going for experiences for the sake of experience, just because you want a high, basically. It's like it's a spiritual drug. So you have a lot of spiritual addicts who just want to feel good and have a hit of that positive spiritual emotion, but it isn't tied to any concrete aim on top of that or beyond that. And that's why I think it's important in reference to that, like to those warnings, Corey, I'll go back to that paragraph that I read where Carpenter recommends to be disciplined, objective, and to protect yourself from from self-deception and to have a scientific attitude seeking more than self-gratification. Because if you're just seeking some kind of spiritual self-gratification, you're entering this jungle, like Ibn Arabi might say, or Chittick. And this is what ties back to Gurdjieff, is this need for objectivity, for testing, for essentially skepticism. Because I think you brought up a really interesting point, Corey, a bit earlier about the nature of the information that one is receiving, right? So you've got Ibn Arabi talking to Adam and Moses and Jesus and Muhammad and all these guys, right? And you have that throughout history. All the prophets are talking to someone specific, right? And then the saints of that religion talk to the same people. Well, we're in a time now where a lot of people don't have the let's say the state of mind where that's a possibility, because there is a skepticism in our modern culture about certain aspects of history and reality, and there's more of a critical mind that can be approached. And I think this is what Gurdjieff actually did, was to apply that level of, or almost the necessity for that Western rationality and skepticism to merge it in a way with the Eastern spirituality, in his terms. And but on the nature of that communication, it's almost like in Ed Kelly's book Irreducible Mind on psi phenomena, and I'll always remember this in the introduction. He talks about the mind and the idea that the mind is oneric in nature. Oneric from oneros, Greek for dream, I believe. That consciousness is basically, and the mind creates order and images and symbols out of meanings. And cut off from the sensory world, it creates dreams, like fantastical images that aren't based in physical reality. But then once you wake up and you're in this waking sleep, then that dream is that function of the mind is now channeled according to the objective things that you're interacting with, the objective meanings that you're interacting with in a space-time environment. So as opposed to some random person being Corey in my dream, now it's actually Corey in reality, and that function of the mind, that image-making function of the mind, is channeled and channeled within the parameters of the physical environment that I'm living in. And so the nature of that level of the mind and dealing with the imaginal, realms, is that it gives form and it gives form to the meanings that are coming. So it may be that is just a function of our mind, that it will take it'll take a form that we're able to accept, for instance. So Ibn Arabi may not have been talking literally to any of these figures, but that's the form that it took. The form that those meanings took for that purpose. Of course, then you get into, again, the dangers of, well, who and what can take what forms and for what purposes. And we were just finished watching the German series Dark, where there's all kinds of manipulations going on, and who's who, and what are they telling the truth, or are they trying to get me to do something that they want, but they're lying about their motivations for what they want me to do, and etc. You walk into a jungle, right? So there is this function of the almost mythic and symbolic and imagery of the imaginal world realm, compared to what we might call like objective reality. So it may be that there's a certain objectivity or reality about the experiences of these mystical visions, but that the form they take is malleable according to the receiver, the person on the receiving end of these visions. And maybe just to close out, I'll read one more little bit from Rosenberg, a kind of mundane, innocuous statement on the surface of it. He writes, "The way other people respond to us is based on a combination of the state they are in and the state we are in. Our emotions play out in the interaction between the state of our autonomic nervous system and theirs." So basically, our interactions are determined by the relative states of our own nervous systems, our own autonomic nervous systems. But that, I think, on that higher level, on that cosmic level, applies to what we were talking about this receptivity of information and the forms that it takes in symbolic form and the imagery that it takes, is that the state we are in determines the level of information we get, and the state there has to be a meeting of minds. Essentially, there has to be a resonance between the two states. If you're in a state of where you're seeking self-gratification, spiritual self-gratification, you might achieve contact with either some part of yourself or some part of the cosmos that is more than willing to feed into that, right? And to just to lead you down the path to self-gratifying yourself into the grave. Or if you have an aim that is different than that, a purpose and a search for meaning that is different than that, then the source of information that you might be able to receive with a critical mind, and with a search for objectivity, may be orders of magnitude greater than that, and more objective, more clear, more just on a higher level. So all of this is to say that maybe it's like you guys have said, it's not a matter of let's say if you look at the First Sight book and I want to work on my psi abilities just because that would be cool. It's like, okay, or let's say you're in a dorsal vagal state, and I want to do whatever. Well, you have to take yourself where you are and go from there. So if you're in a dorsal vagal state and you're depressed and you can't do anything, the immediate concern shouldn't be some manic vision of spiritual enlightenment. It should be getting out of a dorsal vagal state, right? To get into a social engagement state where you can engage with the people around you. And meditating or something might help. Doing body work might help, but on every level your program for your own development should be probably based on where you are at, and with a possible vision of where you could be, of course, to act as a pull to get you there. But basically, to strive for self-knowledge and to know where you are and what's reasonable, what's possible, what the next step might be.
I was just going to say, it sounds like this book has a good framework for understanding where you might be, because that's often the most difficult part. Like, you think it'd be easy to know where you're at, but that could take years and years and years before you figure out where you're at. But if you do some recapitulation and you read a little bit just about the nuts and bolts kinds of stuff, then it's a lot easier to find out, okay, so this is where I'm at psychologically because of these experiences that happened to me and how my clinical symptoms manifest are similar to those that are discussed in polyvagal theory, or this accessing the healing power of the vagus nerve. So I know on this very nuts and bolts machine level, just like I was going to take my car in to the mechanic, I know that these are the things that I need to do in order to make it so that I can function better. And when you have that kind of information, that's some of the most powerful information that an individual can get. And that in and of itself, especially for individuals who are in the state that you're talking about, you hear a lot about empowerment. But there's nothing more empowering than that, because it gives you steps, it gives you little things, it gives you those little things that you can do that will pull you out of that, whatever swamp it is, metaphorically speaking. But really, when it comes down to it, it's this, this shutdown of your nervous system, and it gives you an understanding of yourself, and then that's just from there. There's nothing more empowering for people. Yeah. There's nothing more empowering for any of us, I think, than to know that you do have that strength, that you do have that ability to get out of whatever hell that you're in, and that it's not anybody else's. It's not magic. It's nothing crazy. It's not the professor's fault, or it's not your boss's fault. It's nothing. It's this something that's very much within your control is to heal.
And it has the potential, I think, to, sometimes when you're in this state of confluence with the thoughts and feelings that feel hopeless and negative, it seems you have this tunnel vision and you're operating in a certain mode that it's disenfranchising. It's disempowering. It doesn't let you see any of the other possibilities. And like you were saying, Corey, I mean, the exercises are literally pictures of babies in this book. The exercises in this book couldn't be more gentle. They're not, 2-hour Gurdjieff dances and movements that require a sophisticated degree of synchronized movements according to beat and measure. This is very simple stuff, and yeah, I agree. It can subtly shift your whole framework for how you're dealing with yourself, others, and your reality.
And it's the foundation work, basically. It's like at the Priory, Gurdjieff in his prospectus for the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man said there's a certain amount of repairing of the machine that needs to go on before someone can even engage in self-work. And I think this is an integral part of that, is to basically get your nervous system functioning again, to achieve an adequate level of autonomic nervous system health, to then facilitate the clarity of mind and the physical health needed to be able to engage in some more difficult work. So that said, we'll be talking about this book, I'm sure, some other time, and of course other great topics as well. So if you enjoyed, make sure to subscribe and like, and we will see y'all later. Bye-bye.